Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, will a newly formed ceasefire between the Houthis of Yemen remain intact? This as the Yemeni government troops are supported by Saudi Arabia, and Riyadh itself has sent in many Salafist fighters to battle the Houthis. What is Saudi Arabia's role in the conflict in Yemen, and what does it mean as reports coming out of Saada say that the Houthis have made tremendous gains in the area near the Saudi border?
It's been a decade-long fighting. Back in 2004, a group of Shia fighters in northern Yemen took up arms under the leadership of cleric Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi to fight the Yemeni government. They accused the government of violating the civil rights and marginalizing them politically and economically. The government alleges that the Houthis are seeking to overthrow the ruling establishment and implement their own laws. It took a decade before the fighting expanded to three fronts, namely with government forces, with Takfiris and with Salafi groups. The conflict took on an international dimension in November 2009 as clashes broke out between the Houthi fighters and the Saudi troops along the two countries' common border, as Saudis launched a major offensive there. The Houthis also accused Saudi Arabia of supporting the Yemeni government in attacks against them. They also complained about the US involvement in the war. Reports from Yemen reveal that despite pressures from inside and outside of the country, the Houthis have managed to make huge military advances. Some reports say the group has taken control of a large area along the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia and captured about 1,000 Saudi-backed Salafi insurgents. The fighters have also gained control over some areas of the Ahab district north of the capital Sana'a, as well as several strategic areas in other Yemeni provinces, such as Saada, Amran and Jauf. Most of the clashes have been centered in Saada province. In recent weeks, the town of Damaj in Saada has been the scene of deadly clashes between Houthi fighters and a Salafi group supported by Riyadh. Now, with a shaky ceasefire in place, it remains to be seen whether it will hold or the country will further plunge into violence and instability as a result of marginalization of one of its oldest and most effective communities.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program out of Orlando, Florida, former American intelligence linguist, Mr. Scott Ricard. And out of London, lecturer in Sharia law, Mr. Abu Bara. Thank you both for being with us. We're going to start this off in London with Mr. Bara. Do you think that Riyadh should be involved in the conflict inside of Yemen? And if you do believe that they should be, explain to me why.
I think that the conflict in Yemen needs to be understood in the wider context of the region. The current climate in the Middle East is a division among all the community into two distinct camps. On the one side, there are those who are calling for the Sharia and the establishment of an Islamic caliphate, a khilafah, including Jabhat al-Nusra, Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, and those people, Ansar al-Sharia in Yemen, as well as those people in the wider region as well, in Afghanistan, as well as in Somalia. And the world and the community have been divided into two distinct camps in relation to this call. Those who are in favor of Islam and Khilafah and Sharia, and those who are opposed to it, from the Americans, the Israelis, the British, the apostate and kufr regimes like the Saudi Arabian regime, the Bashar al-Assad regime, the Iraqi Maliki regime, the Iranian regime. And the Houthis are part of an alliance of Shia in this conflict who have sided with those regimes like Bashar al-Assad, like the Iranian regime and the Maliki government and America and Israel, and they are part of the fighting against the predominantly Sunni call for Islamic caliphate and khilafah. The Houthis are engaged in fighting in Syria in support of the Assad regime. So this is the context of the Houthis. The Houthis are not fighting for their rights, they are fighting in favor of the oppression and subjugation of the Sunnis and the stopping of the call for the caliphate. And this is where the Muslims around the world, they will not have sympathy for the Houthi uprising, rather they will side with the Islamists and those people who are calling for Islam.
All right, Mr. Ricard, your perspective. Now, our guest in London basically says that the Shia Houthis, because they are supported by the Americans and the Israelis, and basically are fighting against all Sunnis. However, if we look at the situation on the ground in Yemen, we see that traditionally that the Houthi community have been extremely discriminated against. Your take, sir, on what he has said.
Well, the Houthi community is really the community from the north. And if you know anything about the history of Yemen, it's been incredibly controlled by the West through the British Petroleum Empire and the American oil empire as well. You also have the Dutch that have been involved in the development of the oil assets. Yemen has approximately $15 billion a year in oil revenue, and that makes up about 70% of the government's operation. So the facts remain that this country, much like Saudi Arabia, has been heavily controlled by the Western Empire, and the folks in the north were overthrown about half a century ago in 1962, when they actually were running the country for hundreds of years and in opposition to the actual West and their oil development across the Arabian Peninsula. You don't have to look very far. This happened throughout the Middle East over the last century. This happened in the Arabian Peninsula, in Iraq. It happened also in Africa. It's also happened throughout Persia and also throughout Asia. So there's a real problem here, and the underlying issue really lies within the petroleum and other resource exploitation of the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen. I can get into some details if you'd like to know them, but that's the real crux of this issue.
What about that, Mr. Barr, what our guest in Orlando, Florida has said, that as a matter of fact, it was the Houthis who had been in control of that area for a very, very long time, and it was those who came because of Western interests and to actually get control of the resources in Yemen, basically saying the opposite of what you had stated. Your take, sir.
Actually, it's not the opposite of what I said. What I said very clearly is that the Americans have their own interests and the opposition of the call for an Islamic caliphate. Ansar Sharia in Yemen, as well as Jabhat al-Nusra and the other Islamist organizations, are calling for an uprising and a spring, an Islamic spring, to overthrow regimes who have been typically pro-West and pro-America, like the Saudi Arabian regime, like the Yemeni regime, like the toppled Gaddafi Libyan regime and the Egyptian regime, and they are calling for that uprising in Syria as well. And in this conflict, which is the wider conflict now, in the last 10, 20 years, this is what is relevant to us today. The Houthis have taken an alliance with the Iranians and the Hezbollah and the Assad regime, and they are engaged in clear, explicit, violent uprising and fighting against those Sunnis who are calling, who are the real ones calling for their rights. So
let me just jump in here. Let me ask you about the question. Let me go back to the question, sir. Stay with me. Yes. Let me go back to the question that I had asked. When we're looking at the situation on the ground today, and we see, for example, we have seen the U.S. Actually drones coming in there. We have seen actually the U.S. Along with Saudi Arabia supported the previous regime and continues to support very much that regime. But then on the other hand, we see that the Houthis are actually fighting against that same government that you just now said basically are not believers, as you have actually defined it yourself. So tell me about the contradiction in your perspective and your statements.
I don't understand. There's no contradiction at all. The Yemeni regime indeed is a Kufr regime, and the people who are rising against them were Ansar Sharia. The drone strikes that killed Anwar Awlaki and his son, they were not directed against the puppet regime in Yemen or the puppet regime in Saudi Arabia or their allies in Iran or against Bashar al-Assad. The Western interest is to protect the state of Israel in the region, to protect their oil interests, their strategic and military interests, and those who are opposed to them are those Muslims calling for the the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate. They're uprising today all over the world, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, in Palestine, in Somalia, in Mali, Central African Republic. There is a clear divide in the world today, and the Houthis have taken the stance to support the alliance of the Shia in Iran and Hezbollah and Assad regime.
So let's talk about the Houthis inside of Yemen. My question to you is about Yemen itself and the stance of the Houthis against that same government that you're actually saying is a non-believing government, as you're saying. The Houthis are the ones that are actually fighting against that government. So I'm trying to understand your connection, you said, between Israel, between the United States and the Houthis, but then at the same time you're saying that the government of Yemen is actually a pro-U.S., pro-Israel government. However, the Houthis are the ones that are fighting against it.
Absolutely. The Yemeni government is a kufr regime, an apostate regime that is ruling by man-made laws, and the Houthis are looking to take authority to establish another secular man-made law, Taghut kufr regime, which is in part of the alliance with the disbelievers of Assad regime and the Iranian regime against the Muslims.
Okay, you're not answering my question,
to be
sir.
in favor of that.
I just want a simple answer from you. I want a simple answer from you. You said that the government of Yemen, you said, propped up or supported by U.S. and Israel, and yet, on the other hand, that the Houthis are fighting against them. So are the Houthis in alliance with Israel and the United States or not?
They are in alliance with Iran and Hezbollah and the
U.S.
regime
and Israel
of Bashar
is the question.
al-Assad.
Answer the question. Are they in alliance with the U.S. and Israel in Yemen or not?
They share the common opposition to the Islamic Caliphate with America and Israel.
We're not going to get a clear answer out of you. Let me go to Orlando. Let me turn to Orlando and Mr. Ricard. Unfortunately, could not get a clear answer. Your take, sir, because basically what our guest in London is saying is that it's the Houthis that are in alliance with Israel and with the United States. And yet, if we look at, especially the past few years, we have seen continual resistance by the Houthis against the former government and also the current one. Your take, sir.
Well, my take on this gentleman out of London, he's created a lot of confusion around the real facts of the issues. You know, Abu Bara or Mizanur Rahman, whatever he's calling himself now, this gentleman has incited some incredible violence. You know, I respect his opposition to the West, but the way that he supports his violent opposition, I don't have any respect for that at all. Now, when you look into the real facts around what's going on in the Arabian Peninsula, it's very clear that the Houthis are fighting against the West. It's very clear that the Houthis are obviously supported by places like Turkey, places like Libya, places like obviously Iran, and other places that are also supporting organizations that are trying to fight Western imperialism. Now, the divide between the Salafists or the Wahhabis and the Shiites and the Sunnis, this divide is fueled by the West. This divide is fueled by individuals like Mr. Bara or Rahman. These kind of fueling activities are actually beneficial to the West as long as they can keep the Arabs and the Islamic people fighting with each other. It minimizes their contribution to the chaos. And these kinds of groups have been trained over and over and over again by the West in many different freedom fighters, Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, you name it, all across the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East. This has been going on for well over half a century. So I say to this young man, I don't disrespect his religion, but understand that some things that he's learned when he's young, he's a young man. Look deep into the people you've learned from, and you may have been fooled along the way.
What about that, Mr. Bara? Do you think that what Mr. Ricard has said is possibly true, that actually what we have seen, not only now in Yemen but in many other countries, is an attempt to divide the Muslims in order for others to profit from that division? Your take, sir.
The thing is, despite what you're trying to sort of imply, actually a lot of what he said is exactly the same as what I said. He agrees that the Houthis are supported by Iran and the others, the Syrian regime and the Hezbollah and the part of this alliance. And he agrees with, I agree with him that the Americans fuel the fighting between the Sunnis and the Shia because it's beneficial for them to divide the people so that they can take advantage of them. And I agree with him that the Iranian regime and the Syrian Bashar al-Assad regime, they are in favor of the Houthis over the Sunnis, and they have a campaign against the Sunnis both in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Iran, and in Lebanon. And if you look to the history of the Shia in all this entire alliance, including Iran, there is a history of violence and targeting the Sunni population. In Iran, the execution of Sunni preachers, those who call for any Sunni Islam or just to pray according to Sunnis. They have no mosque in Tehran for the Sunnis. In Iraq, the Maliki government is bombing the camps and the tents for the women and children because they're protesting for their rights.
Mr. Barra,
in Syria,
you are
targeting
getting,
the Sunnis
first of all,
with
Mr.
the rape
Barra,
and the torture.
the issue is, first of all, the issue is Yemen that we're talking about. And second of all, please, if you're going to say something, make sure you have your facts correct when you're talking about different situations. But let's look at the situation in Yemen. Mr. Ricard, when we look at the situation, it appears that it is a community that has been discriminated against. Our guest in London is trying to, unfortunately, turn this into a Shia-Sunni clash. Do you think that it is a sectarian issue, or are we talking about basic human rights actually being given to this minority group or not?
Well, as I said earlier, the real crux of the information here is around the petroleum and resource issues. It makes up a quarter of the gross domestic product for Yemen. And most of the people in Yemen are in the agricultural and sheep herding and goat herding business. It's a very unprosperous society when it comes to the lower class. In the 1990s, when they converted to the rial, it was about 12 rial to the dollar. Now it takes somewhere about 215 to 220 rial to get a dollar. So the decline of the value of the actual monetary system in Yemen and the raping of the actual resources in Yemen has been completely orchestrated by the West and kept these minority individuals who are generating most of the agriculture and most of the food for the country in some of the lowest class of the actual society. You have people that make less than $2,500 to $3,000 a year, and yet you have a very rich society that controls it, that's controlled by the West. So yes, it does have a lot to do with the humanitarian, basically the humanitarian people taking advantage of the individuals in the poor class. Mm-hmm. And they have isolated these individuals and bombed these individuals and actually conducted incredible warfare against these individuals using advanced warfare supported by the West.
What do you think, Mr. Barra, at this point in time, because we see that there is a delicate ceasefire in place right now, what will it take? What do you think has to happen in order for that ceasefire to hold? And do you think that it should hold?
I think the struggle in Yemen needs to be looked into the other parties involved. Not only the Saudi regime involved in this conflict, nor is only the Yemeni regime involved and the Houthis, but you also have the other fighters and Islamists like the Ansar al-Sharia, those who are calling for the Khilaf and the Sharia in Yemen. They are the ones who are part of a wider circle of Islamists around the world who are calling for a particular call, and they are the ones who are able to bring justice and rights to the people, including to the Houthis in Yemen. As long as the Yemeni regime is in power, they will continue to oppress and marginalize communities and continue to take the rights of the people, whereas the call of Ansar al-Sharia is to give the rights to all of the people according to Islam, according to the Khilafah state system, which is revealed in the Quran and Sunnah. So that is the way forward. It is to establish Islam in the region, and for those Islamists to come to rise and to continue to fight and to overthrow the regime of Yemen.
Okay, Mr. Ricord, you're shaking your head, and I also wanted to look at the Saudi involvement in all of this. What will it take, or how important is it to basically be able to stop the intervention of Saudi Arabia in this conflict in order for the people of Yemen to decide their own fate?
Well, it's not just Saudi Arabia. You have Pakistan, you have Morocco, you have the United Arab Emirates. You know, you have a lot of provocateurs that are supporting the actual Western power that's been in place for well over half a century in Yemen. And the individuals that are fighting this are not fighting this with the same amount of support. These are people that are fighting with the minimal amount, but yet they fight because they're protecting something that's really being taken from them. At the same time, you have a lot of generals and a lot of military that are defecting from the puppet Yemen government that the Houthis are fighting. So the people are actually behind the Houthis, even though they're a minority. They understand that it is not an Islamic war. This is not something it's more economic than it is religious. And to focus on the religious aspects of this means that this poor young gentleman has been fooled by the propaganda of the West to try to split the Sunnis and the Shiite.
And on that note, I thank both of my guests for being with me. Out of Orlando, Florida, Mr. Scott Ricord, former American intelligence linguist, and out of London, Mr. Abu Bara, a lecturer in Sharia law. And as always, viewers, we thank you for being with us on another debate. Join us right here, same time, same place tomorrow. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing out from Tehran. Thanks and goodbye.